It was the most ambitious effort at population control through family planning that the modern world had ever seen. China's one-child policy is no more, but the effects linger, particularly in the generations that grew up as state-mandated only children. Joining us now on that, Lynette Ong. She's Associate Professor of Political Science at the U of T's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and Yujia Shi, Research Assistant at the University of Toronto, who grew up an only child in China. Lynette, nice to have you back. You were just here a few weeks ago, so nice to meet you. We're glad you could make some time for us. I don't want to assume everybody has the background on this, so we're going to put a few facts up here. Sheldon, if you would, this graphic, please, and we'll take people through the last nearly 40 years of this experiment. After 2 decades of worrying about China's booming population, China's Communist Party in 1979 enacted a new marriage law. Couples were obliged to practice family planning with a de facto limit of 1 child per family. 5 years later, China adjusted the policy, allowing a second child in specified circumstances, including some families in rural areas and for couples who were both an only child. In 2001, new laws are brought in to manage the policy, including penalties and fines for unapproved births and additional children. 5 years ago, China eases the one-child policy, making some exemptions. And then in 2015, the one-child policy is officially abandoned. Lynette, get us started here. How transformative was this policy on China?
So the population control actually started in the early 50s. But then in 1979, when Deng Xiaoping wanted to develop a market economy, that was at the end of the Cultural Revolution. And then the Great Leap Forward, which happened in the 50s, which resulted in a lot of famine, the greatest famine in the world that was still very fresh on people's mind. So there is an idea that we have to control the population to limit the number of mouths that we have to feed in order to grow the economy. But the underlying idea is really the Malthusian idea that unchecked population growth is going to result in imbalance of food supply and demand and resulted in hunger. So with, thanks to government propaganda, there's actually a deeply held social belief in China that population size, China is the most populous country in the world, its population size is to blame for a lot of social and economic problems.
Yujia, obviously you were not alive in 1979 when this policy was brought in, but based on what you know of the time, did it make sense for China to bring in a one-child policy?
I think it makes sense back then according to the context of China. Firstly, just like a professor said, China was a very populous country. And then there were food shortage back in 1950s. And on top of that, there were foreseeable unemployment in the country. And there were a lot of environmental pressures.
So was there great fear in the land that the population was exploding?
Exactly.
There was. Lynette, was there opposition to this policy?
Well, yes, there was opposition because it's a very harsh and sometimes even violent policy. There was great fear that population is going to grow unchecked. And the official figures suggest that 400 million births have been prevented. But scholars, particularly in the US and some even within China, demographers would argue that even without the very strict one-child policy, you would have kept population growth very much checked with increased income level, changing occupation, changing lifestyle. People want, various things, and they would limit population growth. In any case, you only need to look at, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, with similar cultural values, but with increasing income level, population growth has been declining. So people argue that, China was going to go through lower fertility rates anyway, even without one-child policy.
But, Yujia, to Western sensibilities, the notion that the government can tell you how many children you are allowed to have is outrageous. I mean, we would never stand for this in the West, right? Do you recall having any conversations with your parents about being told by the government you're only allowed to have 1 child and that's it?
Well, there were discussions related to, like in my family at least, or like in the community I live in, or like more about, okay, so we have 1 child and there's a lot of pressure to raise only 1 kid because you have you have a lot of expectations on the one. But there weren't so much opposition against the policy per se. I would say it's really because the culture and like the state and society relation in China is quite different from it is in the West.
How old were you when you had your first, do you remember this? Whether you had a conversation with your parents about the fact that, why am I an only child? Why don't I have brothers and sisters?
I didn't really ask that because back in 1990s, it was almost like the peak of the implementation of the policy. So I didn't really question it because it's the normativity in China. Like all my friends were only child and all the kids in my community are only child. So I don't really question why I'm the only child. But my parents would ask me like a joke. They would be like, do you want to have a brother or sister? Or like, do you want to have a sibling? But like, I was too young to comprehend what it actually means. I always been like, no, like, I want to be the only one.
You didn't mind being an only child?
I didn't mind because...
You did not want a sibling?
No, like back then, no.
Why not?
Because I think it's hard to, like as a kid, it's hard to think about alternatives and what situation would be like if I had another sibling. Because I'm so comfortable being the only child and everybody else is the only child, so I wouldn't really question.
You're happy to have the monopoly on your parents' attention and on all that. Okay, I get it, I get it. Now, we mentioned earlier, Lynette, there were some exemptions made over the years, some exceptions were made. How come?
Well, there were some exceptions made, but there were no exception in densely populated urban areas. People in urban areas are strictly to have only one child. Rural areas, if the first child is a girl or if the first child comes with some sort of disabilities, they could have a second child. And also in ethnic minorities areas. But even though in Xinjiang, that relaxation has recently been tightened.
Can I just follow up on that for a second? You say ethnic minorities. Some ethnic minorities were allowed to have more than one child as opposed to the majority Han Chinese who were not.
Yes.
Why would that be?
Well, this is part of the affirmative action for ethnic minorities. So ethnic minorities in Tibet, Xinjiang, and some in Sichuan areas, they also get a lot of government subsidies, assistance for a bunch of other things. And part of that affirmative action is that they are allowed to have up to 2 to 3 and sometimes 4 children.
Now, how would the government police this to ensure that you did not have a second child if you were not allowed to?
Oh, that is actually done very, very harshly and is part of this population engineering. Very strict implementation of this policy. So there's forced sterilization, there is forced abortion, and when I say forced, it's non-elective surgery, and we often hear stories about village officials going into people's homes, drag women out of their homes, and force them to go to clinics to have abortions. And this is obviously a human rights abuse. There's been a lot of debate and controversy about that. But the key reason why these policies were so successfully implemented is because it's really entrenched in the bureaucratic criteria how local officials are being evaluated, right? So the local officials are given a list of criteria, a list of tasks to do. And one of the ones with veto power is actually one-child policy. If you fail to achieve that, you are considered to have failing all the tasks.
So you're not going to move up the food chain if you allow this to happen?
And for people who actually have more than one child, they get slapped a huge fines. And that fines go on to subsidize the budgets of local governments. So you can see where the incentives come from, which is why this policy has been overly successful in most places.
Yujin, do you know what, or did you ever discuss what might happen to your parents with them if they were to have another child?
I did. Actually, I think my answer from my parents is that my mom would lose her job because she works in a government-affiliated institution.
In what city?
In Xi'an. It's in the middle part of China.
Okay. So there was, did they ever say to you, we'd like to have another child, but it's against the law, we can't?
Not really, because I think there is another concern for them is like how expensive it is to raise a kid. Because in the 1990s, there were already a lot of like economic growth in China with the urbanization and everything. Raising a kid has become more expensive.
Can I ask you a horrible question? Yeah. This is a really horrible question. We know that many Chinese parents favored having boys. Did your parents ever indicate to you a preference, that they wished you were a boy or anything like that?
Not my parents. Like, my mom actually preferred to have a girl because she just loves girl more. But I did hear like comments here and there, especially from grandparents, that they would aspire to have a grandson to carry the family line. And that's just sort of like a like not necessarily popular, but common kind of way of thinking.
Did you hear that from your grandparents?
No, not
But
from
you heard
them.
that they felt that way?
More or less, a little bit.
How do you feel about that?
Like, I disagree with them for sure, but I also understand where it comes from because their way of thinking is not very much anchored in our time.
Amen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's bring this up. This is from the Council on Foreign Relations. Go ahead, Sheldon, let's bring this up. As a result of almost 4 decades of its one-child policy and increases in average life expectancy, China is aging faster than any other country in the world. This has led to a smaller labor force and more dependence. And in 2025, the overall population will begin to decline. The fertility rate still hovers around 1.6, lower than the US rate of 1.87. Even Brazil, which has a similar GDP per capita to China, has a rate of 1.75. Furthermore, Chinese parents have traditionally preferred boys over girls, leading to a massive gender imbalance. In 2017, men outnumbered women by 33 million, and the male-to-female birth ratio was 115 boys for every 100 girls, one of the most skewed in the world. Let us now look at some charts as we continue to look at China's fertility rate and how it compares to the global average. And doesn't that say everything there? Those 2 squiggly lines, the Chinese are just not replacing themselves as some other countries in this world are. And let's talk about the gender imbalance and the implications of that. Lynette, maybe you can help us out with that. There are so many more Chinese boys compared to Chinese girls. Play that forward. What are the implications of that?
Well, the implications are manifold. One is that you have a lot of men, particularly those poorer ones in rural areas, couldn't find a wife. And to take it to the most extreme example, we know that in polygamous society, tribal society, where rich and wealthy men, powerful men could have many wives, leaving the poor men have difficulties finding brides, we tend to see a lot of violence. So that is not happening to China, not to that extent. But if we see this trend continuing, I think we are going to see a society that is increasingly unstable because of that reason.
Yujia, on the other hand, young women can afford to be very, very picky in choosing a husband. Isn't that true?
Yeah, I think so.
Is that a good thing?
I think so, yeah. And I definitely see a lot of increasing gender equality these years, and a lot of women, they can have the choice to whether marry or not. So it's a lot of times it's up to them.
How many years did you live in China?
It was about 20 years.
20 years.
So.
Okay. Did you ever hear conversations among young men about how unhappy they were because of this gender imbalance?
There were definitely setbacks of this gender equality, and I've heard about them complaining especially about how expensive to marry a woman in China now.
Well, also too many guys competing for too few girls. I mean, that is the case.
I would say in urban areas and also especially mega cities like Beijing or Shanghai, actually if you look at demographic of the city, there are more young women than young men.
We're going to put a chart up now, and we're going to leave it up for a bit, Sheldon, because we're going to need some time to go through this. Here's China's population pyramids, as they call them, over the years. And we can see back in 1960, so this is almost 60 years ago, obviously the number of older people in China was very small, and the pyramid then goes out with a larger base as the population gets younger. That is an indication of what demographers would call a healthier society. In 2015, you can see, as a result of the one-child policy, there is a bulge in the middle. You're getting more older people, fewer younger people, and still not that many births, obviously, with the one-child policy. Let us now project to the year 2060. We're in the third column now, and you can see the bulge at the top. There are a lot of older people in China, a lot of senior citizens, and not very many younger people who will be living in society to do the work and earn the money to afford the pensions for the older people and so on. Again, Lynette, the economic implications of that reverse pyramid in the third column, what do you think they are?
Well, aging population, a shrinking labor force will have an negative impact on future economic growth. We only need to look at Japan, which has been suffering from declined economic growth in the last 2 decades. And one of the contributing factors is aging population. And people also compare China with India, saying that India will overtake China's growth rates in the very near future. Part of the reason is population base is very young and is still rapidly growing. And you need a big working population, workforce to power your economy.
Yujia, one of the reasons we're having this conversation is that later tonight on TVO there's going to be a documentary all about this phenomenon of the one-child policy. And one of the things that emerges from the documentary is that there are a lot of only children in China who are going to be solely on their own responsible for their aging parents as they get older. And some of them in the documentary are not too happy about that. They're going to have no help taking care of aging parents. How old are your parents?
They're around 50.
In their 50s. Have you thought about the responsibility that will fall on you once they get into their 70s and 80s and, God willing, into their 90s? Because you're all they've got, right?
I can definitely see, I will definitely see it as part of my responsibility. I'll take on that responsibility when time's needed, when time requires. Yeah.
Does that mean you're going to have to move back to China? Because obviously you're here now.
I haven't really had this conversation with my parents, but I think what they said to me is that they would like to be more independent when they're age. But I know that there are times when they need me. I would be there for them, but where I live in the future really is gonna decided by my career.
Right. In the West, obviously, many older adults end up leaving their homes and they go live in assisted living facilities or seniors' residences or nursing homes, that kind of thing. Can you see that happening in China? Because that traditionally is not the way things happen in China.
No, traditionally, usually their parents are taken care of by their children. But right now, you can see, especially in private sector, that a growing business is focusing on the nursing homes, and also it's really because in the public sector, the state doesn't really have a coherent and effective and efficient policy that really helps with the situation.
Lynette, I mean, here's the bigger question, which is, do you think China could have had the remarkable economic growth and transformation of its society over the last 40 years had the one-child policy not happened?
Yes.
The economic growth still could have happened?
Yes. Yes, I think so.
So are you saying this policy was unnecessary?
I think I would agree with most of my academic scholars that this policy was unnecessary. The fear of unchecked population growth was unnecessary, because we know that with increased income level, changing values, fertility rates are going to drop. People's lifestyle changes occupations. They are going to have fewer children anyway. And with the encouragement of two-child policies, that has actually not been that successful. There has been some uptake, but a lot of people are also resisting it because of deeply socially held belief that one child is sufficient. And China is a society with very high cost of living. 2 children are very expensive. So it's very difficult, I think, to change people's underlying belief.
I know, obviously, for Yujia, it's the only life she has known, but do you personally oppose the policy?
I opposed it on the ground that, number one, I don't think it makes any economic reason. And number two, I think it is a gross human rights abuse. Because of violence, because of how it is implemented, it is really it is really a state policies into people's home, invasion of people's privacy, a form of population engineering, state telling people what to do with their lives, how many kids they are supposed to have, and often under coercion.
So in your view, all of this misery, there was so much misery associated with this policy, need not have happened in your view?
To a great extent, no. No.
Let's read this from the New York Times. Even as officials urge college-educated Han Chinese women to marry and get pregnant, they are discouraging, sometimes through coercion, ethnic minorities with high birth rates, particularly Uyghurs in the northwestern region of Xinjiang, from having more children. Last summer, government officials invoked, quote, ethnic equality to announce the end of a long-standing exception that had allowed Uyghurs and other groups to have one more child than families from the Han majority. Okay, pick up on that. Why do you think they've reversed themselves?
I think that is part of the reason why China has been imposing very strict repression control in Xinjiang because of fear of terrorism. This is really erroneous held belief that Islam and Muslims are equivalent to terrorists. I mean, we can talk about that. There are many reasons behind it, but it's a wrongly held belief of equating Islam and Muslims with terrorism. So they want to convert people with that sort of beliefs and from that ethnic origin into nothing. So people are forced to eat during Ramadan. People are not allowed to wear headscarves, which is traditional cultural values. And limiting the number of children that they could have is just part of these policies, reversing the affirmative action given to ethnic minorities that was in place for many years.
I mentioned just a few minutes ago that we're going to be playing this documentary, Only Me Generation. It's coming up in just a few minutes' time. Let's give people just a little sneak preview of what they're going to see, okay? Sheldon, go.
是不是现在那个女方陪嫁车是？
男方买房，女方买车，这是现金的一般家庭条件都差不多的，就这样。要是稍微差一点，就是女方给我买电车就行了。
那个买车是什么价位呢？一般
都行。买夏利也没人管，买宝马也没人管。我要买2.0的，我不嫌贵嘛，然后说不费油嘛，我说让我妈每天上车再放100块钱，放充电罐，交油钱。
Now, one of the interesting things in this documentary is to see how materialistic many young Chinese are these days, which is very different from what their grandparents would have experienced. But there's an expression in this documentary, Yuja, a boy is a construction bank, a girl is an investment bank. What does that mean?
So it really is a really interesting narration, or like the interesting term on what's going on in the marriage market right now in China. Because in urban areas, a lot of times when a couple are getting married, the guy is expected to have an apartment and house, which are going to provide for their later life, like living after marriage. Mm-hmm. And also, but the girls this expectation doesn't really come for the girls. The girls' family, in my impression, they usually would pay for the wedding, and maybe they'll pay for some furniture in the house. But apart from that, the economic and financial constraint on the girls is usually less when it comes to marriage.
Well, the nickname for Chinese kids is little emperors, isn't it?
Yeah.
You hear that? Little emperors? Mm-hmm. Are you a little emperor?
Not so much.
Not
I
anymore.
Don't think so.
Back in the day? Why do they call them little emperors?
It's because at the early stage of the policy, people are not really familiar with this kind of family structure also. So, and you would see a lot of times, and when parents say only have one children, they really invest everything in the kid. So a lot of times the children is spoiled. But I think when it comes to 1990s, when I was born, sort of like this one-child policy and two parents and one child structure has been normalized. So I'm not, personally, in my experience, I'm not really familiar with the term.
Okay. We got a minute left here. Let me ask you, again, I'm going to ask you a question I have no business asking, but I'm going to anyway, given the subject of the conversation. Do you want to have kids someday?
Yeah, I think so.
How many?
Yeah, maybe 2.
You would like to have more than one?
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, because I think it's precisely because I grew up alone, and I want to see what it's like when my kid has a sibling. I wonder what the dynamics would be different at home.
That is a very interesting answer. Yu Jie, I want to thank you very much for coming in and answering my very impertinent questions so honestly. We appreciate it. Lynette Ong, it's great to see you again. Thank you for your visit tonight, and do come again. Thanks to you both.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.